Tim Burton has captured hearts for over 2 decades, carving out a distinctive style that embraced the weird and the wonderful. His name became synonymous with stories about outsiders, characters who didn't fit the mold but found a way to charm audiences nonetheless. Burton made being different his brand, and people loved him for that. But somewhere in the 2010s, that magic seemed to fade. While Burton's films still carried his unmistakable aesthetic, something was missing from the heart of his storytelling. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children is a perfect example of this shift. A movie that seemed destined for Burton's touch, full of strange characters, eerie settings, and a world just slightly different. But it somehow failed to meet the expectations that people had for his work. In this video, we'll dive into what went wrong, why, despite the promise of peculiarity and a director known for embracing the odd, and more importantly, what does this tell us about the direction of Burton's work during this period? Tim Burton's name is synonymous with the strange and the unusual. Films like Edward Scissorhands and The Nightmare Before Christmas not only defined his career but also created new visuals and narrative style that connected with audiences who didn't feel like they fit into the mainstream. Burton became the master of giving a voice to the outsiders, whether it was a boy with scissors for hands or a skeleton king in love with the idea of Christmas. His visual style was dark but inviting, blending gothic elements with whimsical characters who navigated the complexities of society. But what truly made his films resonate were the deep human emotions behind the peculiar aesthetics. These characters, despite their odd appearances, were incredibly relatable. Edward Scissorhands wanted acceptance and love. Jack Skellington, despite being the ruler of Halloween Town, was searching for meaning and purpose. This is why Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children seemed like a perfect match for Burton, a house full of strange and gifted children, isolated from the world, with a fantastical time loop setting. It had all the right ingredients. Fans expected Burton to work his usual magic, blending the dark and the whimsical with a deep emotional core, but something didn't quite connect. Aesthetically, Miss Peregrine ticks all the Burton boxes. The cinematography is stunning, the characters are unique, and the world feels like something only Burton could create. But beyond the visuals, the film feels hollow. It lacks the emotional depth that defined Burton's early work. Let's start with Jake, the film's protagonist. Jake is a teenager struggling to find his place in the world, a classic Burton-esque character trope. But unlike Edward Scissorhands or Lydia from Beetlejuice, Jake doesn't seem to have any clear desires. He moves through the story in a passive way without any strong emotional connection driving him forward. We never get a sense of what Jake truly wants. Does he want to belong? Does he want to escape his ordinary life? The film never makes this clear. This lack of clarity in Jake's motivations creates a disconnect between the character and the audience. As viewers, we're never fully invested in his journey because we don't understand what's at stake for him. Compare this to Edward Scissorhands, where Edward's desires for acceptance is crystal clear from the moment he steps into suburbia. We feel for him, we root for him because his struggle is universal. Jake, on the other hand, feels distant and emotionally flat. One of the biggest weaknesses in Miss Peregrine is the lack of meaningful character development and emotional arcs. Jake's relationship with Emma, for instance, feels rushed and unearned. Within hours of meeting, they're suddenly thrust into what feels like a fully committed relationship, without any of the emotional build-up that typically accompanies a romantic subplot. There's no slow burn tension, no meaningful exchanges that show why these two characters are drawn to each other. Compare this to the relationships in Burton's earlier films. Think about how long it took for Edward Scissorhands and Kim to build a connection, or even the slow realization of love between Victor and Emily in Corpse Bride. These relationships had emotional depth, built over time through shared experiences, making their outcomes feel earned and impactful. Jake and Emma, on the other hand, lack the emotional foundation, making the relationship feel shallow and and frankly forgettable. Beyond that, the film is also strangely unaware of the emotional complexities of its characters. Jake's relationship with his parents is barely explored, and the movie seems to gloss over how emotionally disconnected Jake is from them. They're absent, both literally and figuratively, leaving Jake's emotional landscape largely barren. Without any real ties to his family, it's hard to feel the weight of his decision to leave them behind. Another significant issue with Miss Peregrine is its lack of real conflict. The major conflict, the danger from the hollows, doesn't arrive until 3/4 of the way through the film. Up until that point, the story goes on without any clear directions, and without any immediate threat or obstacles. It becomes difficult to stay engaged. In storytelling, tension is everything. When a character sets out on a journey, there should always be a but, something that prevents them from getting what they want. It creates rhythm in the narrative, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats. But in Miss Peregrine, the lack of meaningful obstacles robs the film of that tension. By the time the conflict arrives, it feels like too little, too late. Contrast this with Edward Scissorhands or even Beetlejuice, where the conflict is woven into the story from the start. In Edward Scissorhands, the moment Edward steps into suburbia, he faces obstacles: his difference, his vulnerability, and the town's eventual rejection of him. These challenges drive the story forward and give the audience something to root for. In Miss Peregrine, the story lacks the momentum, drifting along without the but that's so essential to a good narrative. Watching Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, it's easy to wonder if Tim Burton has forgotten the magic that made his earlier films so beloved. Burton's best films weren't just visually striking, they were emotionally resonant. His characters, though strange, were deeply human, struggling with universal desires for acceptance, love, and identity. But in the 2010s, Burton's work began to lean more heavily on aesthetics, sometimes at the expense of emotional depth. Take Alice in Wonderland, Dark Shadows, and Miss Peregrine's, all visually stunning, yet all lacking the emotional core that made films like Edward Scissorhands so unforgettable. As if Burton, in his quest to outdo himself visually, has lost sight of what made his earlier work resonate on such a deep emotional level. But with the release of Wednesday and Beetlejuice 2, there are glimmers of hope that Burton is reconnecting with what made his earlier films so special. Perhaps after a decade of struggle, he's ready to return to the emotional storytelling that defined his career. In the end, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children failed not because it wasn't visually stunning, but because it lacked the emotional depth and meaningful conflict that once made Tim Burton's films so magical. Jake's lack of clear motivation, the rushed relationships, and the absence of real obstacles left the film feeling hollow, beautiful to look at, ultimately forgettable. As Tim Burton moves forward with new projects, one can only hope that he will return to the emotional storytelling that made his earlier work so beloved. After all, it was never just the peculiarity of his characters that made us love them, it was their humanity. What do you think? Has Tim Burton lost his magic, or is he on a verge of comeback? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.